autumn sun hung low over the vast expanse of prairie grass, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. A hot, dry wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant dust storms. This was Colorado Territory in 1885, where civilization ended and the wilderness began, where men carved out lonely existences amid the unforgiving terrain of rock, sand, and endless sky. Jake Morrison sat astride his weathered bay mare, surveying his herd of longhorns as they grazed on the sparse vegetation. At 34, he cut a solitary figure against the horizon, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows across a face weathered by sun and sorrow. His ranch, if one could call the collection of rough-hewn buildings that sprawled at the base of the red rock formations that marked the eastern edge of his property. It wasn't much, a main house with walls that groaned in the wind, a barn that had seen better days, and a few outbuildings that served their purposes without any pretense of comfort or beauty. Jake had lived alone for the past 7 years, ever since the cholera outbreak of '78 had swept through the territory like wildfire, claiming his wife Sarah and their infant daughter in the span of 3 terrible days. The epidemic had taken half the population of nearby Cedar Ridge, leaving behind a town of ghosts and grieving survivors. Jake had buried his family beneath the lone cottonwood tree that stood sentinel over a small rise behind the house, and since then, he'd spoken little to anyone beyond what necessity demanded. The townsfolk of Cedar Ridge knew him as a man of few words but fair dealings. Once a month, he'd ride the 12 miles to town for supplies, conduct his business with quiet efficiency, and return to his isolation before nightfall. Some whispered that grief had turned him strange, others that he'd always been meant for solitude. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in between. On this particular October afternoon, Jake was returning from one such trip to town, his saddlebags loaded with coffee, flour, salt, and the few other staples that sustained his simple existence. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when he noticed something unusual on the horizon. 2 figures moving slowly across the barren stretch of land that separated his property from the main road. At first, he thought they might be travelers who'd lost their way. But as his mare carried him closer, he realized these were no ordinary wayfarers. 2 women, their clothing torn and dust-covered, stumbled forward with the desperate gait of those who had been walking far too long. Their bonnets hung askew, barely shielding faces that bore the unmistakable marks of exposure and exhaustion. Jake reined in his horse 20 feet from them, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the butt of his Colt .45. Years of living on the frontier had taught him caution, though these 2 hardly looked capable of posing any threat. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from disuse. The women stopped, swaying slightly on their feet. The taller of the 2, a woman who might have been pretty under different circumstances, raised her chin with a dignity that belied her disheveled state. "Sir," she managed, her voice cracked and dry, "we mean no harm. We're trying to reach Denver City." Jake's eyes swept over them, taking in the quality of their clothing beneath the dirt and tears. These were not frontier women, but ladies of some standing, or had been. The shorter woman, younger by perhaps 5 years, clung to her companion's arm, her dark eyes wide with what might have been fear or fever. "Denver's near 60 miles north," Jake said flatly. "On foot, through this country. You won't make it, not without water, food, or proper shelter." The older woman's composure cracked slightly. "We have nowhere else to go." "Please," the younger one whispered, speaking for the first time. "We've been walking for 2 days." Jake studied them for a long moment. Every instinct honed by years of solitary living told him to offer directions to the nearest way station and ride on. He didn't need complications, didn't want them, but something in their bearing, perhaps the way they held themselves despite their obvious distress, stirred a memory of his own Sarah, proud even in their humble circumstances. "What are you running from?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. Women didn't find themselves alone in the wilderness without cause. The two exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them in that single look. Finally, the older one spoke. We're married to the same man, sisters by marriage, not blood, the Hartley family of Denver. She paused, gathering strength. We were cast out. Our husband died 6 months past, and his family, they said we were worthless. Neither of us could give them what they wanted. Sons, the younger woman added bitterly. We gave them daughters, 3 between us, but daughters don't carry the family name, don't inherit the business. So they kept our children and sent us away with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He'd heard such stories before, knew the harsh realities women faced in a world that valued them primarily for their ability to produce male heirs. The injustice of it sat poorly with him, though he'd never had cause to dwell on such matters. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the path. The younger woman shivered despite the day's lingering heat. Jake could see they were at the end of their strength. Already, the shadows were growing long, and the temperature would drop precipitously once the sun set. Out here, with no shelter and wild animals prowling, they wouldn't survive the night. He made his decision with the same swift certainty he used when cutting cattle from the herd. My ranch is 3 miles west, he said, gathering his reins. You can water there, rest for the night. Come morning, we'll see about getting you to Denver properly. Hope flickered in their eyes, quickly tempered by wariness. We have no money to pay for, the older woman began. Didn't ask for any. Jake cut her off. He dismounted, knowing they'd never keep pace with him riding. Name's Jake Morrison. I run cattle on about 2,000 acres hereabouts. Margaret Hartley, the older woman said after a moment's hesitation. This is my sister, Rebecca. Jake nodded, not pressing for more information. He could see the wedding bands still on their fingers, could read the story of their recent ordeal in every line of exhaustion on their faces. Taking his mare's reins, he began walking, setting a pace they could manage. This country's hard on everyone, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. But it's pure hell on those traveling unprepared. Rattlesnakes, wolves, weather that can turn from scorching to freezing in a matter of hours. You're lucky I came along when I did. Lucky, Rebecca repeated softly, and Jake heard the weight of everything that word didn't encompass. They walked in silence for a time, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the grass and the steady clop of his horse's hooves. As they crested a low rise, Jake's ranch came into view, and he heard Margaret's quiet intake of breath. It wasn't much to look at. He knew. The buildings seemed to huddle together against the immensity of the landscape, dwarfed by the red rock cliffs that rose behind them. But there was smoke rising from the chimney, promising warmth, and the sight of the water pump by the barn must have seemed like salvation to his parched companions. It's not fancy, Jake said, suddenly aware of how his bachelor establishment might appear to women accustomed to city comforts. But it's solid, and it's safe. It's perfect, Margaret said quietly, and Jake was surprised to hear she meant it. As they approached the house, Jake found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd lived alone for so long, had grown comfortable in his solitude. Now he was bringing 2 strangers into his home, women with their own troubles and histories. But as he glanced at their drawn faces, he knew he couldn't have ridden past them any more than he could have left a calf to die in a blizzard. This way, he said gruffly, leading them to the house. We'll get you water first, then food. Questions can wait for morning. The women followed him wordlessly, and as Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door of his home, he had the strangest feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in his carefully ordered world. The autumn wind gusted behind them, driving them inside, and Jake closed the door against the gathering dusk, sealing them all into whatever fate had brought them together. The interior of Jake's house reflected its owner functional, sparse, and bearing the unmistakable marks of a space inhabited by someone who had long ago stopped noticing his surroundings. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark. Rough-hewn furniture, made by Jake's own hands in the early days of his widowhood, filled the main room. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, testament to the bachelor's indifference to housekeeping. Margaret and Rebecca stood just inside the doorway, their eyes adjusting to the dimness. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, striking a match to light the oil lamp on the table. The yellow glow pushed back the shadows, revealing more clearly the humble dwelling that would be their shelter. "Sit," Jake said, gesturing to the wooden chairs near the table. "I'll get the fire going." The women sank into the chairs with visible relief, and Jake could hear the younger one, Rebecca, trying to suppress a whimper as she eased her blistered feet from her worn boots. He busied himself at the fireplace, arranging kindling and logs with the automatic movements of long practice. Soon, flames began to lick at the dry wood, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the November night pressed against the windows. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered moments later by another. The sound seemed to make the women draw closer together, reminding Jake of how foreign this wilderness must seem to them. He moved to the kitchen area, really just a corner of the main room with a wood stove and some shelves, and began heating water in a battered kettle. From a high shelf, he retrieved a tin of coffee, the one luxury he allowed himself on his monthly trips to town. "When did you last eat?" he asked without turning around. "Yesterday morning," Margaret answered quietly. "Some bread we managed to take when we left." Jake's jaw tightened. Cast out with nothing, forced to steal bread to survive. He'd seen cruelty in his years on the frontier, but this casual discarding of women who had committed no crime save biology struck him as particularly callous. He set about preparing a simple meal beans from a pot he'd cooked that morning, reheated with some salt pork for flavor, and cornbread from a batch he'd made 2 days prior. It wasn't much, but it was filling and hot. As the coffee boiled, its rich aroma filled the small space, seeming to revive the women somewhat. "Here," he said gruffly, setting plates before them. "It's plain fare, but it'll stick to your ribs." They ate slowly at first, as if afraid to seem too eager, but hunger soon overcame propriety. Jake poured coffee into 3 tin cups, the liquid black as midnight and strong enough to float a horseshoe, as the cowboys liked to say. He noticed how Rebecca's hands shook as she lifted the cup, whether from exhaustion or emotion. He couldn't tell. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence that none of them seemed inclined to break. Jake found himself studying his unexpected guests in the flickering light. Margaret appeared to be near 30, with auburn hair that probably shone like copper when clean and properly dressed. Her face bore the kind of bone structure that spoke of good breeding, though lines of strain had etched themselves around her eyes and mouth. Rebecca was younger, perhaps 25, with dark hair and eyes that reminded Jake of a deer's large, watchful, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said finally, her voice stronger now with food and warmth in her belly. Jake nearly laughed at that. Beautiful? This rough cabin with its bachelor's neglect. But he saw she was serious, her eyes taking in the solid walls, the tight-fitted windows that would keep out wind and rain, the stone fireplace that would hold heat through the night. "It serves," he said simply. "We don't mean to impose," Rebecca began, but Jake cut her off with a gesture. "You're not imposing," I offered. He paused, then added more gently, "Been a long time since anyone sat at this table besides me. 7 years. In fact..." Something in his tone must have conveyed more than he intended, for Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Your wife? Cholera. Took her and our baby girl." The words came out flat. Matter of fact. He'd learned that was the only way to speak of it without the grief overwhelming him. "I'm sorry," Rebecca whispered. Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy. It was a long time ago, but time, he'd learned, meant nothing to grief. It was always there, like the mountains on the horizon, sometimes distant and hazy, sometimes close enough to block out the sun. "You spoke of the Hartley family," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "Big outfit in Denver. aren't they? Mining interests. Margaret's face tightened. Yes, my late husband, our late husband, was Charles Hartley. His father built the business. His brothers run it now. She met Jake's eyes steadily. They never approved of Charles's arrangement, having 2 wives. It wasn't improper, Rebecca said quickly, defensively. We knew of each other from the beginning. Charles was honest about his intentions. He needed heirs, multiple heirs, to secure different branches of the business. We were... She paused, searching for words. We were friends, Margaret and I, sisters, truly, in every way but blood. Jake nodded slowly. He'd heard of such arrangements among the wealthy, though they weren't common. Practical alliances, more business than romance, designed to produce the all-important male offspring that would carry on names and fortunes. But you had daughters, he said. 3 daughters, Margaret confirmed, and her voice broke slightly. My Emma and Jane, Rebecca's little Mary. Beautiful, clever girls, all of them. Tears gathered in her eyes but didn't fall. They kept them, of course, said we had no right to them, no claim, the law. She trailed off. The law favors men in all things, Rebecca finished bitterly. We were nothing more than broodmares to them, and when we failed to produce colts, they sent us to the knacker. The crude comparison made Jake shift uncomfortably, but he couldn't argue with its accuracy. He'd seen enough of the world to know how it valued women primarily for what they could produce, whether sons or labor or comfort for men. So they just threw you out? The morning after Charles's funeral, Margaret said. His brothers arrived with legal papers. The marriage contracts, they said, were void upon Charles's death since we'd failed to produce male heirs. We had 1 hour to pack, but we weren't allowed to take anything of value. Those belonged to the estate. They said, for the real heirs. Our daughters, Rebecca added, her voice thick with unshed tears. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. He'd seen men do terrible things for money, for land, for power. But to separate mothers from their children, to cast women out into the wilderness with nothing, that spoke of a cruelty that went beyond mere greed. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and Jake rose to add more wood. The women had finished their meal, were sipping the last of their coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls and making the windows rattle in their frames. Where were you planning to go in Denver? He asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. The women exchanged glances. We hope to find work, Margaret said carefully. Perhaps as seamstresses or housekeepers. We both have skills. Without references, without connections. Jake shook his head. 2 women alone in a city like Denver, with no money and no friends. You know what kind of work would be available to you. The unspoken implication hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca's face flushed, while Margaret's went pale. We would rather die, Margaret said quietly, with a dignity that impressed Jake despite himself. Might come to that anyway, he said bluntly. Denver's no place for women in your situation. It's rough, getting rougher. The mining camps are full of men who haven't seen a decent woman in months. 2 ladies like yourselves. Obvious quality even in your current state. You'd be noticed, and not in ways you'd welcome. Then what would you have us do? Rebecca burst out, her composure finally cracking. We have nothing, no one. Our families want nothing to do with us. We're disgraced women, cast-off wives. Where can we go? What can we do? Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. He thought of the empty rooms in his house, the silence that pressed in on him during the long winter nights. He thought of the work that always needed doing, work that wore a man down when he had to do it all alone. He thought of his Sarah, how she would have opened her heart and home without hesitation to women in need. You can stay here, he heard himself saying, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. Through the winter, at least, until you figure out something better. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. Mr. Morrison, Margaret began carefully. That's extraordinarily generous, but we couldn't possibly— Why not? Jake interrupted. I've got the room. Got more work than one man can handle. You'd earn your keep. Make no mistake about that. This ranch doesn't run itself. People would talk, Rebecca said softly. A man living with 2 women. Jake's laugh was short and humorless. Let them talk. They do anyway. Hermit Jake, crazy Jake, the man who talks to ghosts. What's one more story for them to tell over their whiskey? He could see them wavering. Hope warring with propriety and fear. He understood. They were city women, raised with certain expectations and social rules. What he was offering went against everything they'd been taught about proper behavior. Look, he said more gently. I'm not asking for anything improper. You'd have the back room to yourselves. It's got its own door, can be barred from the inside. You'd work. I'd provide shelter and food. Come spring, if you still want to try for Denver or anywhere else, I'll take you there myself, with supplies and whatever money you've earned. But for now— He gestured toward the windows, where frost was already forming on the glass. Now you need to survive. Pride won't keep you warm when the snow flies. Margaret looked at Rebecca, another of those silent conversations passing between them. Finally, she turned back to Jake. We accept, she said simply. And we thank you. Jake nodded, suddenly awkward now that the decision was made. Right then, let me show you the room. He led them through a door at the back of the main room, into what had once been meant as a nursery. It was small but clean, with a window facing east and a small pot-bellied stove for heat. 2 narrow beds stood against opposite walls. Jake had built the second in a fit of optimism early in Sarah's pregnancy, imagining the large family they'd have. It's perfect, Rebecca said softly, and Jake saw tears finally spill down her cheeks. I'll bring in more wood for the stove, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the emotion. Extra blankets are in that chest. There's a bar for the door. Use it. I'll knock come morning. He turned to go, but Margaret's voice stopped him. Mr. Morrison, why are you doing this? Jake paused in the doorway, considering, why was he doing this? Loneliness, Christian charity, the memory of his Sarah's compassion? Because, he said finally, someone should. He closed the door behind him, heard the soft thud of the bar falling into place. Moving back to the main room, he banked the fire for the night and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, he could hear the murmur of women's voices through the thin walls, the first human sounds besides his own that had filled this house in 7 years. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, wolves sang to the crescent moon. But inside the sturdy walls of Jake Morrison's house, 3 souls who had been alone in their different ways settled in for the night, unaware that fate had more in store for them than mere survival. Dawn came slowly to the Colorado Territory, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Jake Morrison was already up, as was his habit, moving quietly through the morning routine he'd perfected over years of solitude. He'd built up the fire, set coffee to boiling, and was mixing batter for flapjacks when he heard the soft scrape of the bar being lifted from the back room door. Margaret emerged first, her hair hastily pinned up, yesterday's travel-worn dress somewhat straightened, despite her disheveled state. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity he'd noticed the day before. Rebecca followed, looking younger in the morning light, her dark eyes still puffy from sleep or tears. Morning, Jake said without turning from the stove. Coffee's ready. Breakfast in a few minutes. Mr. Morrison, Margaret began. We should discuss— Eat first, he interrupted. Plenty of time for talking after. They sat at the table, hands wrapped around tin cups of coffee, while Jake served up flapjacks with molasses and thick slices of bacon. He noticed how they ate with better appetite than the night before. Amazing what a night's sleep in safety could do for a person. Through the window, the early morning sun revealed a thin layer of frost covering the ground, making the prairie grass sparkle like scattered diamonds. In the distance, the red rock formations glowed as if lit from within. It was the kind of morning that reminded Jake why he'd stayed on this hard land, even after losing everything that mattered. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said softly, following his gaze. "Different from Denver, I expect." Jake replied. "Denver was never really home," Margaret said. "Just another place we lived for a while." When breakfast was finished and the dishes cleared, Jake pushed back from the table. "Right then, if you're staying, you need to know how things work around here." He led them outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch spread before them, not large by territorial standards, but substantial enough. The barn stood solid and weathered, built to withstand the fierce winter storms. Beyond it, a corral held a dozen horses, their breath steaming in the cold air. In the distance, his cattle were already moving, dark shapes against the frost-white grass. "Main work is tending the cattle," Jake explained as they walked. "Come winter, that means checking them twice a day, making sure they can get to water, watching for sick ones. I've got about 300 head scattered across 2,000 acres." Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter. Both women were shivering in their inadequate clothing. Jake made a mental note to dig out some of Sarah's old things from the trunk in the barn. He'd never been able to bring himself to dispose of them, and now he was glad. "What can we do to help?" Rebecca asked. "We don't know anything about cattle. Don't need to, not at first. There's plenty else needs doing." Jake pointed to the chicken coop, which had stood empty since his last flock had been taken by coyotes 2 years back. "Could start keeping chickens again. Eggs would be good to have. And you could sell the extra in town." They moved to the barn, where Jake showed them the milk cow he kept. "She needs milking twice a day. I've been managing, but it's one more chore I could do without." "I can milk a cow," Margaret said with a small smile. "My grandmother had a small farm in Ohio. I spent summers there as a girl." Jake nodded, pleased. City women who knew something of farm life. That was better than he'd hoped. He showed them the vegetable garden, now dormant with winter approaching but ready for spring planting. The root cellar with its stores of potatoes, turnips, and preserved goods. The smokehouse where he cured meat. The spring-fed well that provided fresh water even in the driest months. "It's like a small village unto itself," Rebecca observed. "Has to be," Jake replied. "Town's 12 miles off, and in winter, sometimes you can't make that trip for weeks at a time. Everything you need to survive has to be here." They were passing the barn again when Jake noticed both women stumbling with fatigue. Their ordeal had taken more out of them than they were admitting. "That's enough for now," he said. "Let's get you some proper clothing." In the barn's loft, tucked away in a corner, sat the trunk he'd avoided for 7 years, cedar-lined and sturdy. It held the things Sarah had treasured. Jake's hands hesitated on the latch. Then he opened it decisively. Sarah would have wanted her things used to help women in need. Inside were dresses, practical ones in sturdy cotton and wool, undergarments, carefully folded, a warm cloak the color of forest moss, 2 pairs of boots, barely worn, even some men's clothing, shirts and trousers Sarah had made for Jake but never had the chance to give him. "We couldn't," Margaret breathed, understanding immediately what these things were. "You need them. They're sitting here doing no good," Jake said brusquely. "Take what fits." He left them to sort through the clothes, returning to the house to give them privacy and himself time to compose his emotions. Strange how opening that trunk had brought Sarah back so vividly. Her laugh, the way she'd hummed while sewing, her dreams for their future. An hour later, the women emerged transformed. The clothes fit reasonably well, and more importantly, were warm and suitable for ranch life. Margaret wore a brown wool dress that brought out the auburn in her hair, while Rebecca had chosen a blue cotton that made her look even younger. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, and Jake could see she understood the magnitude of what he'd shared. The rest of the morning was spent in basic lessons. Jake showed them how to check for eggs, though there were no chickens yet. How to approach the milk cow without startling her. How to fork hay from the loft. They were clumsy at first, city-soft hands struggling with unfamiliar tools. But both women showed determination that impressed him. By midday, clouds had rolled in from the west, heavy and gray with the promise of snow. Jake taught them to read the weather signs, the way the cattle bunched together, how the horses grew restless, the particular quality of light that preceded a storm. "First snow usually comes by late October," he said. "We're overdue." They ate a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples. Then Jake announced he needed to ride out and check the far pastures before the weather turned. "We'll come with you," Rebecca said eagerly. Jake shook his head. "Not today. You're not ready for that kind of riding, and I don't have gentle mounts for beginners." He saw the disappointment in their faces and added more kindly, "Give it time. Ranch life isn't learned in a day." While he was saddling his horse, Margaret approached. "Mr. Morrison, we need to discuss arrangements. Payment for our lodging. What's expected of us? You work, you eat and sleep warm," Jake said, checking the cinch. "Come spring, we'll figure out wages if you're still here. For now, just focus on learning what needs doing." "That seems unfair to you." "Ma'am," Jake interrupted. "Nothing about your situation is fair. Let's not compound it by worrying about what's owed where. You need help. I need help. Sometimes it's that simple." He mounted up before she could argue further, touching his hat brim in farewell. As he rode out, he glanced back to see both women standing in the yard, watching him go. Something about the sight, two figures against the backdrop of his lonely ranch, made his chest tighten oddly. The afternoon's ride took him to the far reaches of his property, where the land rose into foothills dotted with piñon pine and juniper. He found his cattle where expected, huddled in a box canyon that provided shelter from the wind. A quick count confirmed all were present, though a few showed signs of lameness that would need attention. By the time he started back, the first snowflakes were falling, fat and lazy in the still air. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and Jake urged his horse to a faster pace. Winter storms could turn vicious without warning, and he had more than himself to think about now. He was still a mile from home when the snow began in earnest, driven by a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. His horse knew the way. Thank God, because visibility dropped to mere yards. Jake pulled his coat tighter and trusted his mount, thoughts turning to the two women alone at the ranch. Had they remembered to bring in extra wood? Did they know to keep the fire banked high? When the buildings finally loomed out of the swirling white, Jake felt a relief that surprised him. Smoke rose from both chimneys. They'd figured that much out at least. He quickly unsaddled his horse, gave him extra grain, and headed for the house. The warmth hit him like a physical thing as he entered. Both women looked up from where they sat near the fire, and he saw genuine relief in their faces. "We were worried," Rebecca said, then blushed as if she'd said too much. "Takes more than a little snow to stop me," Jake replied, shaking the white from his coat, but he was oddly touched by their concern. When was the last time anyone had worried about him? The smell of cooking filled the air, and Jake realized they'd started supper beans and cornbread again. But somehow, it smelled better than when he made it. "We found your supplies," Margaret explained. "I hope that's all right. We wanted to have something hot ready when you returned." That's good," Jake said, unsure how to respond to such simple thoughtfulness. "That's what you're here for, to help out." They ate together as the storm raged outside, the windows rattling in their frames. The women told him about their day. Rebecca had successfully milked the cow after 3 attempts. Margaret had reorganized the pantry and taken inventory of supplies. "We'll need more flour before winter sets in properly," Margaret noted. "And sugar, salt, coffee." Jake nodded. "I'll make a trip to town before the roads become impassable. You can come along. Get anything else you might need." "We have no money," Rebecca reminded him quietly. "I'll cover it. Take it out of your wages come spring." He saw them exchange glances and added firmly, "No arguments. Can't have you freezing or starving over winter. That helps no one. Later, As they sat by the fire, the women mending clothes they'd found that needed repair. Jake cleaning his rifle. Rebecca asked, "Do you get many storms like this?" "This is just a taste," Jake replied. "Wait till January. Snow can pile up past the windows, trap you inside for days. Wind howls so loud you can't hear yourself think. Some folks go a little crazy from it." "And you?" Margaret asked. "Do you go a little crazy?" Jake considered the question. "Maybe I did, that first winter after... But you learned to live with the silence. Or I did, anyway." "Well," Rebecca said softly, "you won't have silence this winter." No, Jake thought, looking at the two women who had arrived as strangers just the day before but already seemed to belong in his house. He wouldn't have silence this winter, for the first time in 7 years. That thought didn't frighten him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the harsh landscape in deceptive softness, but inside, warmed by fire and unexpected companionship, 3 souls who had known too much of cold and loneliness began the slow process of thawing. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind that shook the walls and snow that piled against the windows until the glass was just a dim, white glow. The temperature plummeted until even standing near the fire couldn't completely chase away the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. Jake had weathered many such storms, but never with others depending on him. He found himself constantly checking their wood supply, rationing their food more carefully than when he'd been alone. The women, for their part, adapted with surprising resilience. Margaret took charge of keeping the fires burning steadily in both the main room and their bedroom, while Rebecca melted snow for water and helped Jake with the twice-daily trek to the barn to tend the animals. That trek was the worst part, even with a rope strung between house and barn, a precaution Jake had installed years ago. The journey through the blinding snow was treacherous. The wind hit like a physical blow, driving ice crystals that stung exposed skin like needles. Jake wouldn't let the women attempt it alone, so they went together, him leading the way with Rebecca clinging to his coat and Margaret holding onto Rebecca. "How did the cattle survive this?" Rebecca shouted over the wind during one such journey. "They huddled together in the draws and canyons." Jake called back, "The weak ones don't make it. That's the hard truth of it." Inside the barn, they worked quickly, milking, feeding, checking water that had to be broken free of ice every few hours. The animals' body heat made it marginally warmer than outside, but their breath still came in white clouds. Jake noticed how gentle Rebecca was with the animals, how she talked to them in soothing tones despite her obvious fear of their size. On the second night of the storm, as they huddled around the fire after another meager supper, supplies were running lower than Jake liked. Margaret asked, "How long can these storms last?" "Longest I've seen was 8 days. Jake replied, "Back in 81, lost half my herd that winter." He saw the worry flash across their faces and added quickly, "But this one's not that bad. Weather like this, you learn to read the signs. This'll blow itself out by tomorrow night." "You sound very certain," Margaret observed. "You live out here long enough, you get a feel for it. The land talks to you, if you know how to listen." Rebecca was staring into the fire, her face troubled. "Our daughters," she said suddenly. "Do you think they're warm tonight? Do you think they're wondering where we are?" Margaret reached over and took her hand. "They're in a fine house with servants and warm fires. Whatever else the Hartleys are, they won't let the children suffer physically." "Physically," Rebecca repeated bitterly. "But what about their hearts? Mary's only 4. She won't understand why Mama suddenly disappeared." Jake shifted uncomfortably. He had no words of comfort for this particular pain. The loss of a child, whether through death or separation, was a wound that never fully healed. "Tell me about them," he said instead. "Your daughters." Rebecca's face lit up despite her tears. "Mary's the youngest. She has the most beautiful singing voice, like a little bird, always making up songs about everything she sees." Her voice caught. "She was singing when they took her from my arms. A song about butterflies." "Emma's 8, Margaret added softly. "So serious for her age, always reading, asking questions about everything. She wanted to know why the sky was blue, why water freezes, how birds know to fly south. A sad smile crossed her face. The Hartleys thought too much education would ruin a girl's prospects. I wonder if they'll let her keep her books. And Jane. 6 and fearless as a boy, always climbing trees, catching frogs, coming home with torn dresses and scraped knees. Charles used to laugh and say she should have been born a son. Margaret's voice turned bitter. Maybe then we could have kept them all. They fell into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake found himself thinking of his own daughter, who had lived only 3 days. Sarah had been so sure it would be a boy, had even picked out the name William after her father. But when the baby arrived, small and perfect and female, she'd looked at him with such joy and said, "Lily, she's our Lily." 3 days, that's all they'd had before the fever took first the child, then the mother. Jake had held that tiny body, marveled at the perfect fingers and toes, the delicate features that might have grown to look like Sarah's. Sometimes he wondered if it wasn't better to have lost her so young, before she could walk or talk or call him Papa. But no, even those 3 days were precious. Even that brief time was better than never having had her at all. "They'll remember you," he said suddenly. Both women looked at him in surprise. "Your daughters. They'll remember. Maybe not everything, especially the youngest, but they'll remember being loved. That doesn't go away." "How can you know that?" Rebecca asked, tears flowing freely now. "Because I remember my mother." Jake said simply, "She died when I was 6. Cholera. Same as took my wife and daughter. I don't remember everything. Her face is hazy now, like looking through fogged glass. But I remember how she made me feel. Safe. Loved. Important." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "That feeling, it stays with you, shapes you. Your girls will have that, even if they have nothing else." Margaret was crying now too, silently, dignified even in her grief. "Thank you," she whispered. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small circle of firelight, the silence was comfortable rather than oppressive. Jake realized with some surprise that he'd shared more of himself in these few minutes than he had with anyone in 7 years. On the 3rd day, Jake's prediction proved correct. By late afternoon, the wind began to die down, and gaps appeared in the clouds, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky. The temperature was still brutal, but the worst had passed. "We need to check the cattle," Jake announced. "See how many we lost. We'll come with you," Margaret said firmly. Jake started to refuse, then saw the determination in both their faces. They'd been cooped up for 3 days, and perhaps they needed to see the wider world, even a frozen one. "You'll need better clothes," he said. He dug out his old winter gear, extra coats, scarves, mittens that Sarah had knitted. The women bundled up until only their eyes were visible, and Jake had to admit they looked almost comical, but they were warm, and that's what mattered. The world outside was transformed. Snow had drifted up to the eaves of the barn in places, while other spots were swept nearly bare by the wind. The sky was a crystalline blue that hurt to look at, and the air was so cold it seemed to freeze in the lungs. Jake saddled 3 horses, choosing the gentlest mounts for the women. "Stay close," he instructed. "These horses know their business, so trust them. And if I say move, you move without question." "Understood." They nodded solemnly, and he helped them mount. Rebecca gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, while Margaret sat straighter, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. They rode slowly through the transformed landscape, the horses picking their way carefully through the drifts. Jake led them to the nearest sheltered canyon, where he knew cattle would have gathered. As they crested a rise, the scene below made all 3 of them catch their breath. The cattle were there, hundreds of them, pressed together so tightly they looked like one massive, dark creature against the white snow. Steam rose from their bodies in a great cloud. Around the edges, Jake could see the still forms of those that hadn't made it, the old, the weak, the unlucky who'd been on the outside when the cold became too much. So many dead, Rebecca breathed, horrified. Less than I feared. Jake countered. Maybe 20 out of 300. I've seen worse. He dismounted and moved among the living cattle, checking their condition, breaking ice from the spring that provided water. The women watched from their horses, and he saw them beginning to understand the harsh mathematics of survival out here. As they rode back, the sun was setting, turning the snow-covered landscape into a wonderland of pink and gold. Jake heard Rebecca gasp and turned to see her staring at the view with wonder. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Beautiful and terrible all at once. That's the frontier." Jake agreed. "It'll kill you without a second thought, but Lord, sometimes it shows you things that make your heart stop." That night, with full bellies, Jake had butchered one of the frozen cattle, and they'd had fresh beef for the first time since the women arrived. They sat around the fire with a different energy. The storm had tested them, and they'd survived. More than that, they'd worked together, depended on each other. "We need supplies," Jake announced. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds, we'll make the trip to town." "Are you sure the roads will be passable?" Margaret asked. "Main roads should be broken by now. Others will be heading to town too, after the storm." He paused. "Fair warning, folks will be curious about you. Word travels fast out here." "What will you tell them?" Rebecca asked. "The truth. You're helping out on the ranch for room and board. Anything else is none of their business." But even as he said it, Jake knew it wouldn't be that simple. 2 women living with a bachelor rancher. The gossips would have a field day. But looking at Margaret and Rebecca, survivors of their own storms, he found he didn't much care what anyone said. "We survived the blizzard," Margaret said with a small smile. "I think we can handle a few curious townspeople." Jake nodded, returning her smile. "I believe you can at that." Outside, the wind had finally stilled completely, leaving the world in crystalline silence. Stars were beginning to appear, brilliant in the clear sky. Inside, the fire crackled cheerfully, and for the first time in years, Jake Morrison's house felt like a home. The morning of the town trip dawned clear and cold, with a pale sun offering light but little warmth. Jake had the wagon ready early, having spent the previous evening checking the wheels and axles, making sure everything was sound for the 12-mile journey. He'd loaded it with the frozen beef he intended to trade at Morrison's general store. No relation, despite the name, and covered the bed with heavy canvas. Margaret and Rebecca emerged from the house bundled in their warmest clothing, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Jake noticed they'd taken extra care with their appearance, hair neatly pinned and faces scrubbed clean. He understood. This would be their first time facing the outside world since their exile from Denver society. "Ready?" he asked, helping them up onto the wagon seat. Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. Rebecca looked more nervous, her hands twisting in her lap. Jake climbed up beside them, taking the reins. "Remember," he said as the horses started forward, "you don't owe anyone explanations. Answer what you're comfortable answering. Ignore the rest." The journey to Cedar Ridge took 3 hours through the snow-covered landscape. The main road had indeed been broken by earlier travelers, but it was still rough going in places where drifts had blown across. Jake handled the team with practiced ease, while the women held tight to the seat and each other. As they traveled, Jake pointed out landmarks: the lightning-struck cottonwood that marked the halfway point, the rocky outcropping where he'd once taken shelter during a summer thunderstorm, the draw where antelope sometimes gathered. He found himself talking more than usual, perhaps to ease their nervousness, or perhaps because their presence made the familiar journey feel new somehow. Cedar Ridge appeared around a bend, looking smaller and shabbier than Jake remembered. The storm had left its mark here too. Several buildings showed damage, and crews were working to clear snow from the main street. The town consisted of one main thoroughfare, lined with false-fronted buildings, a few side streets with houses and smaller businesses, and the inevitable collection of saloons that serve the cowboys and miners who pass through. As Jake guided the wagon down Main Street, heads turned. He saw curtains twitch in windows, saw conversations stop mid-sentence as people stared. Two respectably dressed women with Jake Morrison. This was news indeed. He pulled up in front of Morrison's general store, ignoring the curious looks. "Ladies," he said formally, helping them down. "Let's get our business done." The store's interior was warm and crowded with goods, everything from bolts of cloth to mining equipment to candy jars. Tom Morrison, no relation, as he always reminded people, looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening with surprise. Jake and guests. Mrs. Margaret Hartley and Mrs. Rebecca Hartley. Jake said evenly. "They're helping out at my place. We need supplies." Tom's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline, but he had the sense not to comment. "Of course. What can I get you folks?" What followed was a careful dance of commerce. Jake negotiated for flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and other staples, while Margaret added items he hadn't thought of. Thread, needles, soap, lamp oil. Rebecca had wandered to the fabric section, running her fingers longingly over a bolt of blue calico. "Add 10 yards of that calico," Jake told Tom. "And whatever notions the ladies need for sewing." "We can't," Margaret began, but Jake cut her off with a look. "You need proper clothes for ranch work. Consider it an investment in labor." Other customers had entered the store, and Jake could feel their stares, hear the whispered conversations. Mrs. Patterson, the town's most notorious gossip, made no effort to hide her curiosity. "Why, Jake Morrison," she said, approaching with a false smile. "How wonderful to see you in town. And these must be your house guests?" "They're working at my ranch," Jake said curtly. "How unusual. 2 women. I mean, are they relations of yours?" "No." Mrs. Patterson waited for more, but Jake had turned back to his business. He heard her huff of frustration as she retreated to share this non-information with her cronies. Their next stop was the feed store for grain and chicken stock. Jake had decided to restart the chicken flock as the women suggested. Here they encountered Jim Bradley, a neighboring rancher Jake had known for years. "Jake," Jim greeted him warmly, then tipped his hat to the ladies. Ma'am." "Jim, these are Mrs. Margaret and Mrs. Rebecca Hartley. Ladies. Jim Bradley runs the Double B Ranch north of mine." Jim's weathered face creased in a friendly smile. "Pleased to meet you, Jake. I heard you lost some cattle in the storm." "About 20 head. You?" 30 or more. Worst storm I've seen in years." Jim glanced at the women with genuine concern. "You ladies picked a hard time to come to the territory. That storm was a killer." "We managed," Margaret said quietly. "Mr. Morrison was very helpful." "I'll bet he was," Jim said, and Jake was grateful to hear no innuendo in his tone. "Jake's good people. You're lucky to have found him." After Jim left, Rebecca whispered, "He seemed nice." Jim solid. Jake agreed. Not everyone will be so accepting. His words proved prophetic at their next stop, the bank, where Jake needed to withdraw money for their purchases. Edgar Hollis, the bank president, was a small man who wielded his tiny portion of power like a club. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his eyes fixed on the women. "I heard you'd taken in boarders." "Employees," Jake corrected. "Indeed. And what sort of employment do married women perform on a cattle ranch?" Jake felt Margaret stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, she spoke in the cultured tones of a woman used to dealing with officious men. "The same sort of employment women perform on farms and ranches throughout the territory. Mr. Hollis, we cook, clean, tend animals, garden, preserve food, and maintain the household. Or did you think Mr. Morrison's ranch ran itself?" Hollis flushed. "I merely meant, we know what you meant," Rebecca said quietly but firmly. "And the implications are insulting to all parties involved." Jake completed his banking in silence while Hollis fumbled with the papers. As they left, Jake caught himself almost smiling. City women they might be, but they had backbone. Their final stop was the doctor's office. Jake wanted Doc Winters to look at a cut on his hand that wasn't healing properly, but really he wanted the women to know where to find medical help if needed. Doc Winters was a woman, one of the few lady doctors in the territory, which had scandalized Cedar Ridge when she'd arrived 2 years ago. Now most folks had gotten used to her, especially since she was skilled and didn't charge as much as the previous doctor, Jake Morrison. "Doctor," Sarah Winters said warmly, "what have you done to yourself now?" As she cleaned and rebandaged his hand, Jake made introductions. He saw the quick assessment in the doctor's eyes as she looked at the women, their worn faces, their thin frames despite several days of good food. "Ladies," "Doctor," Winters said carefully, "if you ever need medical attention, please don't hesitate to come see me. Women's troubles especially. I understand things that male doctors sometimes don't." "Thank you," Margaret said softly, and Jake saw a look pass between the three women that spoke of shared understanding. The ride home was quieter than the journey there. Jake could sense the women processing all they'd seen and heard. As Cedar Ridge disappeared behind them, Rebecca finally spoke. "They all think we're your mistresses." Jake's hands tightened on the reins. "Some do. The fools always think the worst. Doesn't it bother you? Your reputation?" "My reputation?" Jake laughed shortly. "I'm the hermit who talks to ghosts, remember? Can't do much damage to that. But we could leave," Margaret said quietly. "Find somewhere else. In winter, with no money, no connections, no references." Jake shook his head. "Besides, you're not running again. You've done enough of that." They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves on frozen ground. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "That woman, the doctor, she was kind. Sarah Winters is good people. Came out here after her husband died. Needed a new start. Folks gave her grief at first, but she proved herself. Now most wouldn't trust anyone else. A widow, making her own way," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "It can be done, then. It can." Jake agreed. "It's not easy, but it can be done." As they neared the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. The house looked welcoming with a smoke rising from the chimney, the barn solid and reassuring beside it. "Thank you," Margaret said suddenly. "For today, for defending us, for treating us like people," Rebecca added. "Not all men would." Jake felt uncomfortable with their gratitude. "You're earning your keep. Nothing more to it than that." But as he helped them down from the wagon and they began unloading supplies together, Jake knew there was much more to it. These women had survived scandal, abandonment, and a killing storm. They'd faced down the judgment of a small town with dignity. They were survivors, and Jake found himself respecting them more each day. That night, as they sorted through their purchases and planned the work ahead, the house felt different, fuller, warmer, more alive. Margaret had bought white flour and promised biscuits for breakfast. Rebecca spread the blue calico on the table, already planning the dresses she'd make. "We could start the chickens in the small shed," Rebecca suggested. "Fix it up proper, build nesting boxes. And I thought we might expand the garden come spring," Margaret added. "Maybe try some new vegetables. I saw seed packets at the store." Jake listened to them plan, watched them sketch out ideas with enthusiasm. For the first time in 7 years, someone else was investing in his ranch, seeing a future here. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. "Spring's a long way off," he reminded them. "We'll be here," Margaret said simply. And Jake realized he believed her. Outside, the winter night closed in, cold and vast and full of dangers. But inside, in the circle of lamplight, 3 people who had been alone in different ways continued building something new, not just a working arrangement, but perhaps, cautiously, a kind of family. The winter months passed in a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. By February, The women had transformed from city refugees into capable ranch hands. Margaret could milk the cow faster than Jake himself, while Rebecca had developed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes by watching the animals' behavior. The chicken flock they'd started now provided fresh eggs daily, with enough surplus to trade in town. Spring arrived slowly, first as a softening in the air, then as patches of brown earth appearing through the melting snow. Jake found himself watching for the first green shoots with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the promise of easier weather, it was the plans the women had made all winter. Their enthusiasm for planting and growth infectious. On a particularly fine April morning, Jake was repairing fence posts in the near pasture when he heard laughter from the direction of the house. He looked up to see Margaret and Rebecca working in the newly expanded garden plot, their sleeves rolled up and faces flushed with exertion. Rebecca was saying something that made Margaret laugh again, the sound carrying across the warming air like music. Jake realized he'd stopped working entirely, just standing there watching Rebecca as she pushed a strand of dark hair back from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he'd thought buried with Sarah. He forced himself back to work, driving posts with perhaps more force than necessary. But throughout the day, he found his eyes drawn to Rebecca, the grace of her movements, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, her gentle handling of the young plants they were setting out. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Margaret announced she was going to take some eggs to the Bradleys' ranch the next day. Jim's wife mentioned they were short when I saw her in town last week. It would be neighborly. "That's a 5-mile ride," Jake said. "I'll take you." "No need," Margaret said briskly. "I've been practicing. I can manage the mare perfectly well now. Besides, you and Rebecca need to move the cattle to the south pasture tomorrow." Jake started to protest, then caught something in Margaret's expression, a knowing look that made him suddenly aware of how obvious his feelings must be. He felt heat rise in his neck. "If you're sure," he said gruffly. The next morning, Margaret set off early with a basket of eggs and fresh bread, leaving Jake and Rebecca alone for the first time since the women had arrived. They worked in companionable silence at first, driving the cattle slowly across the ranch. But Jake was acutely aware of her presence in a way that made him feel like an awkward boy. They stopped at midday by the creek to water the horses and eat the lunch Margaret had packed. Rebecca sat on a fallen log, her face turned up to the sun, and Jake thought he'd never seen anything so beautiful. "You're different than you were," she said suddenly, not opening her eyes. "How so?" "When we first came, you barely spoke. Now sometimes I can't get you to stop talking about the ranch, the animals, your plans for expansion." She smiled. "It's nice. You have a pleasant voice when you use it." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He studied his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "I've been thinking," Rebecca continued, "about what happens when spring is over. You said we could stay through winter, and we have. You said come spring we could go to Denver if we wished." Jake's stomach tightened. "You wanting to leave?" She opened her eyes then, looking directly at him. "No, but I wonder if you still want us to." "No!" The word came out more forcefully than he intended. "That is, you're welcome to stay. Both of you. You've more than earned your place here." "Is that all?" Rebecca asked softly. "Just earning our place?" Jake met her eyes, saw something there that matched the feeling in his chest. "Rebecca." She stood, moving closer. "I know Margaret told you about our marriage. How it was arranged, businesslike. Charles was kind enough, but there was no feeling between us. I did my duty, tried to give him sons, but my heart was never engaged." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "I think that's why God didn't bless me with the boys the family wanted. Perhaps he knew I was meant for something else." "Rebecca," Jake said again, his voice rough. "I'm no good at pretty words. Haven't been with a woman since Sarah died. Don't know how to court proper anymore. I don't need pretty words," she said simply, And I don't need courting. We're not children. Jake, we both know what loneliness feels like, what loss feels like. Maybe that's enough foundation for something new." Jake stood slowly, reached out to brush that persistent strand of hair back from her face. His hand lingered against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch. "Margaret," he began. "Margaret knows. She's known probably before either of us did. She's happy for us, Jake. She loves me like a sister, wants me to find happiness." Rebecca smiled. "Besides, I think she's quite content with her independence. Did you know she's been corresponding with Dr. Winters about medical training?" Jake was surprised. "No, I didn't. She didn't want to say anything yet, but Dr. Winters thinks Margaret has the makings of a good nurse. There's such need out here, and Margaret, she's found her own purpose. I think—" Jake felt something ease in his chest. He'd worried about the complications, the dynamics of their unusual household, but perhaps they could forge their own way, make their own rules. "I loved my wife," he said carefully. "Part of me always will, but she's been gone 7 years, and I think she'd want me to live again. Really live, not just exist." "I would never ask you to forget her," Rebecca said. "How could I, when I carry my own ghosts? But maybe we can help each other build something new while still honoring what was." Jake cupped her face in his weathered hands, marveling at the softness. "You sure about this? People in town already talk. This would give them more fuel." Rebecca laughed, a sound like creek water over stones. "Let them talk. They've never walked in our shoes, never faced what we've faced. I stopped caring about society's opinion when that same society cast me out for failing to birth sons." Jake leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was gentle, tentative, two people remembering what it meant to connect with another. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "Well," Rebecca said, a blush staining her cheeks, "that was—" "Yeah," Jake agreed eloquently. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, adjusting to this shift between them. Then Jake cleared his throat. "We should get the kettle moving. Storm coming in from the west." Rebecca looked at the clear blue sky skeptically. "How can you tell?" "Mare's been tossing her head all morning. Cattle are restless. Air has that feeling." He smiled. "You'll learn to read it too." They worked the rest of the afternoon in comfortable partnership. No longer employer and employee, but something more. Jake found excuses to help her with tasks, their hands brushing as they worked. Rebecca hummed as she rode, a light tune that reminded Jake of her daughter's singing she'd described. By the time they returned home, Margaret was back, looking pleased with herself. "The Bradleys were so grateful for the eggs," she reported over dinner. "And Jim mentioned he has a milk cow that's about to calve. If it's a heifer, he'll trade it to us for some of our chickens. We could start our own dairy, sell butter and cheese in town." "That's ambitious," Jake said, but he was smiling. "Why not be ambitious?" Margaret challenged. "This ranch has good bones, good water, good grazing. With proper management, it could be quite profitable." She went on describing her visions for the ranch, and Jake found himself getting caught up in her enthusiasm. Rebecca added her own ideas, and soon they were deep in plans for the future. Later, as the women cleaned up from dinner, Jake heard Margaret say quietly to Rebecca, "So, did you talk?" Rebecca's blush was answer enough. Margaret smiled and squeezed her hand. "I'm happy for you, for both of you." "You don't mind?" Rebecca asked anxiously. "We've been together through so much, and will continue to be," Margaret said firmly. "Just because you found love doesn't mean our friendship changes. We're family, you and I, in all the ways that matter." That night, as Jake banked the fire, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, he'd been a hermit, nursing old wounds and going through the motions of living. Now his house was full of warmth and laughter, plans and purpose. He'd found love again, unexpected and sweet. Through the wall, he could hear the soft murmur of women's voices, Margaret and Rebecca talking as they did every night, sharing the day's events and tomorrow's plans. The sound no longer made him think of what he'd lost, but of what he'd found. Spring was here, bringing new growth and new beginnings. Jake Morrison, who'd thought his heart was as frozen as winter ground, was learning that with the right conditions, even the most barren soil could bloom again. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing the scent of rain and growing things. The storm he'd predicted was moving in, but Jake felt no anxiety. The house was solid, the animals were safe, and the people inside were where they belonged. Let the storm come. They would weather it together, as they had weathered everything else. He climbed the stairs to his room, pausing at the landing. Through one door, soft lamplight showed Margaret reading. Through another, Rebecca was brushing out her long dark hair, humming that same light tune. Jake smiled and continued to his own room. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was always work on a ranch, always something needing attention. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Jake Morrison went to sleep not dwelling on the past, but anticipating the future. The thunder of hoofbeats shattered the peaceful May morning. Jake looked up from shoeing a horse to see 6 riders approaching fast from the east. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against the barn wall. But then he recognized the lead rider's distinctive black stallion. The Hartley brothers had come calling. "Margaret! Rebecca!" he called sharply. "Get inside the house, now!" The women, who had been working in the garden, looked up in alarm. Rebecca's face went white as she too recognized the riders. Margaret grabbed her arm and they hurried inside. But Jake saw them watching from the window. He stood waiting in the yard as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. William Hartley, the eldest brother, dismounted first. He was a big man, soft from city living but still imposing, dressed in expensive clothes unsuited to ranch country. His brother Thomas remained mounted, as did 4 men Jake didn't recognize, hired muscle by the look of them. "Morrison," William said without preamble, "we've come for the women. They're not yours to come for," Jake replied evenly. William's face reddened. "They're our property by law. They abandoned their legal residence. After you threw them out with nothing but the clothes on their backs." "That's a lie," Thomas sputtered from his horse. "They left of their own accord." Jake laughed humorlessly. "Is that the story you're telling? Interesting, considering they arrived here half dead from exposure and starvation." "Whatever sob story they've told you," William said coldly. "The fact remains that they have obligations to the Hartley family. Debts to be settled." "What debts?" Jake demanded. "The debt of not bearing sons. The debt of being human women instead of breeding stock." One of the hired men snickered. William shot him a glare that silenced him quickly. "Their children need them." William tried a different tack. "Surely you wouldn't keep mothers from their daughters." That was a low blow, and Jake felt his temper flare. "You're the ones who kept them from their daughters. You stole those children and cast their mothers out. Don't stand there and pretend concern for those girls now." "Nevertheless," William said, his tone hardening, "they're coming with us, one way or another." Jake shifted slightly, positioning himself better. "No, they're not. There are 6 of us. Morrison, you're one man. One man on his own land, defending his home." Jake's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "You ride onto my property making threats. That makes you trespassers at best, criminals at worst. The law cuts both ways." "Hartley." "You dare threaten us?" Thomas blustered. "Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are." Jake said, "You're the men who threw away 2 good women because they couldn't give you sons. You're the men who kept mothers from their children out of spite and greed. You're cowards who need hired guns to do your dirty work." The hired men shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons. Jake didn't flinch. "But more importantly," he continued, "you're men who don't understand the code out here. This isn't Denver, where your money and name mean something. Out here, a man's word is his bond, and a man who mistreats women is lower than a snake's belly. "You self-righteous," William began, but stopped as the house door opened. Margaret stepped out, Rebecca behind her. Both women held themselves straight and proud, though Jake could see the fear in their eyes. "William, Thomas," Margaret said coolly, "why are you here?" "To bring you home where you belong," William said, his tone switching to something falsely paternal. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. Your children need you." "Our children?" Rebecca's voice cracked with emotion. "The children you stole from us, the children you told we were dead to them." Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was, perhaps, hasty. We're prepared to be reasonable. Come home, fulfill your duties, and you can see the girls." "Under what conditions?" Margaret asked. "Supervised visits. An hour a week if we're obedient. If we submit to being bred again like cattle." "You have obligations," William started. "We fulfilled our obligations," Rebecca burst out. "We gave Charles 3 beautiful, healthy daughters. We ran his household, hosted his business associates, stood by him through everything. And how were we repaid? Cast out like garbage the moment he was in the ground." "You failed in your primary duty," William said coldly. "The contracts were clear." "The contracts?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Yes, let's discuss those contracts. The ones that gave Charles all rights to any children born. That left us with no property rights, no recourse, no protection. The ones your father drew up to ensure the Hartley name and fortune would never be diluted by female inheritance." "That's business," Thomas said defensively. "That's cruelty," Jake interjected. "And it ends here. These women have made new lives. They're not going back to be your prisoners." "Prisoners?" William scoffed. "They lived in luxury. A cage is still a cage, no matter how gilded." Margaret said quietly, "We choose freedom. You choose this." Thomas gestured dismissively at the ranch. "This backward existence with a man who's not even your husband." Jake saw Rebecca stiffen at the insult. He stepped forward slightly. "Careful, Hartley. You're on dangerous ground." "Are you threatening me?" Thomas demanded. "I'm telling you plain." Jake said, "These women are under my protection. They work this ranch. They've earned their place here. More than that, they're respected members of this community. You try to take them against their will, you'll answer to more than just me." As if to underscore his point, Jake heard horses approaching. Jim Bradley appeared around the barn, rifle casually cradled in his arms. With him rode his 2 sons and 3 hands from his ranch. "Morning, Jake," Jim called cheerfully. "Saw strangers riding hard toward your place. Thought you might need a hand with something." Jake felt a surge of gratitude. "Morning, Jim. Just having a discussion with the Hartley brothers from Denver." "That's so?" Jim dismounted, his men spreading out casually but strategically. "Well, any friends of Jake's are welcome, long as they're peaceable." The implied threat wasn't lost on William. His face darkened as he realized the odds had shifted. "This isn't over," he said to Jake. "You think you've won something here? You've got no idea who you're dealing with. I have lawyers, connections, and I have friends," Jake said simply. "Real ones. The kind that show up when there's trouble, not the kind you have to pay." William looked like he wanted to say more, but Thomas leaned down from his horse. "William, let's go. This isn't the place." "Listen to your brother," Jake advised. "Turn around, ride back to Denver, and forget about these women. They've suffered enough at your hands." "My daughters?" Rebecca started forward, but Margaret caught her arm. "If you ever love those girls," Margaret said to the brothers, "you'll tell them their mothers love them. Tell them we think of them every day. Tell them we'll never stop fighting to see them again." Her voice broke slightly. "Tell them we're not dead. Whatever you've said before." For a moment, Thomas looked almost human. "Margaret, no," she cut him off. "You made your choice when you stole our children and cast us out. Live with it, as we've had to." William remounted his horse with stiff movements. "This isn't over," he repeated. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Looking forward to it." Jake said dryly, "Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." The Hartley brothers and their hired men wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising in their wake. Jake and the others watched until they were out of sight. "Thank you, Jim," Jake said quietly. Jim Bradley grinned. "What are neighbors for? Besides, couldn't let city folks think they can ride in here and push people around. Sets a bad precedent." His men murmured agreement. One of them, a young hand named Pete, added, "Those ladies make the best apple pie in the territory. Can't have someone taking away our pie source." That broke the tension. And even Rebecca managed a weak smile. "I'll make sure to bake extra next time, Pete." After the Bradley crew left with thanks and promises of pie, Jake turned to the women. Rebecca was trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, and Margaret didn't look much better. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get inside." Over strong coffee liberally laced with Jake's medicinal whiskey, they sat around the table in silence for a while. "They'll be back," Margaret said finally. "Or their lawyers will. William doesn't give up when he wants something." "What could they want?" Rebecca asked. "They have everything. The money, the houses, our daughters." "Control," Jake said. "Men like that can't stand losing control. You walked away, made new lives. That threatens them." "We should leave," Margaret said quietly. "Go somewhere they can't find us. California, maybe, or Oregon." "No," Jake's voice was firm. "You're not running again. This is your home now. We'll fight them if we have to." "You don't understand," Rebecca said desperately. "They have money, lawyers, influence. They could make things very difficult for you. Jake, we won't let you suffer for our troubles." Jake reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. "Your troubles are my troubles now. That's what it means to care for someone. But, no buts." He looked at both women. "You've been pushed around enough. Time to push back. We'll get our own lawyer. There's a good one in Colorado Springs. Document everything. And we'll make our own case about them abandoning you." "What case?" Margaret asked bitterly. "The law is on their side." "Maybe back east," Jake said. "But this is the frontier. Judges out here take a dimmer view of men who throw women out to die. Especially women who've since become respectable members of a community." He squeezed Rebecca's hand. "Besides, possession is 9/10 of the law. You're here, established, working. That counts for something. And the community supports you," Rebecca said slowly, hope creeping into her voice. "Jim Bradley and his men just proved that." "Exactly." Jake smiled grimly. "The Hartleys might have money, but money only goes so far out here. Character counts more, and you two have proven yours 10 times over." Margaret straightened in her chair. "You're right. We've cowered long enough. If they want to fight, they'll get one." "That's the spirit." Jake approved. "Now, I'll ride to the Springs tomorrow. Talk to that lawyer. You two stay close to the house for a few days, just to be safe, and we'll start documenting everything when you arrived, what condition you were in, all the work you've done here. And we'll write to the children," Rebecca said suddenly. "Even if the letters never reach them, we'll write. Someday they'll know we never stopped loving them, never stopped fighting for them." The rest of the day was subdued, but purposeful. They went about their regular tasks. But Jake noticed the women stayed closer together, drawing comfort from each other's presence. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Rebecca moved to sit beside Jake, leaning into his solid presence. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up to them. For standing up for us. Always will." He promised. "That's what partners do." Margaret watched them with a small smile. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "a year ago I thought my life was over, cast out, disgraced, separated from my children. But now I have a home, work that matters, people who care about me for who I am, not what I can produce." She paused. "The Hartley brothers did us a favor, though they'll never know it. They set us free." "To new beginnings," Jake said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "To family," Rebecca added, including Margaret in her warm gaze. "The kind you choose. To freedom." Margaret concluded, and the courage to keep it. They touched cups, the clink of tin on tin a small sound of defiance against those who would cage them again. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a point of light in the vast frontier darkness. Inside, 3 people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to face whatever came next, together. Summer arrived in full glory, painting the prairie in shades of gold and green. The garden Margaret and Rebecca had planted was thriving, rows of vegetables promising good harvest. The expanded chicken flock pecked contentedly in their yard, and the new milk cow Jim Bradley had traded them was producing enough for butter and cheese to sell in town. More importantly, there had been no further word from the Hartley brothers since their confrontation in May. The lawyer Jake had hired in Colorado Springs, a sharp young man named David Sterling, had sent several strongly worded letters to Denver, making it clear that any attempt to force the women's return would be met with legal action. He'd also begun building a case about the abandonment and the women's rights to see their children. It was a Sunday afternoon in July when Jake found Rebecca sitting alone by the creek, her feet dangling in the cool water. She'd been quieter than usual lately, and he'd learned to recognize the signs of when she was thinking of her daughter. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She smiled and patted the grass beside her. "Please do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water sparkle in the sunlight. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Mary would be 5 now. I wonder if she still sings." Jake took her hand, offering silent comfort. They'd had many such moments over the past months, learning to navigate the grief that would always be part of their lives. "Tell me about the first song she ever made up," he said. Rebecca's face softened with memory. "She was barely 3. We had a canary in a golden cage. Charles loved exotic birds. Mary would stand by that cage for hours, mimicking its songs. One day she started adding her own words, something about flying to the moon to eat cheese with the mice." She laughed softly. "It made no sense, but it was beautiful to hear. She sounds special. They all are. Are." Rebecca shook her head. "I never know which tense to use. They're alive, but lost to us. Present, but absent." Jake squeezed her hand. "Sterling thinks there's a chance. Judges are starting to recognize mothers' rights more, especially in cases of abandonment. Sometimes hope is harder than despair," Rebecca said quietly. "At least with despair, you know where you stand." Before Jake could respond, they heard horses approaching. Both tensed. Memories of the Hartley brothers' visit still fresh, but it was Margaret calling out cheerfully. "There you are. We have visitors coming. I saw Doctor. Winter's buggy on the road." They made their way back to the house to find Doctor. Sarah Winters just arriving, but she wasn't alone. A small figure sat beside her in the buggy, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 with auburn hair visible beneath her bonnet. Margaret gasped. "Emma?" The girl looked up, and her face broke into a brilliant smile. "Mama!" What followed was chaos of the best sort. Emma flew from the buggy into Margaret's arms, both of them crying and laughing at once. Rebecca stood frozen, hope and fear warring on her face, as if this might be a cruel dream. "Doctor." Winters climbed down more sedately, a satisfied smile on her face. "I hope you don't mind the surprise. I thought it best not to send word ahead, in case things went wrong." "How?" Jake managed, as amazed as the women. "Let's go inside," Dr. Winters suggested. It's quite a story. Over tea and the cake Rebecca had baked that morning, Dr. Winters explained. "I have a colleague in Denver, Dr. Marcus Webb. We correspond regularly about medical matters. I happened to mention your situation. No names, just the circumstances. He was appalled and offered to look into it quietly." "And?" Margaret prompted. Emma curled against her side as if she'd never let go. "It turns out the Hartley household has been in some upheaval. The younger brother, Thomas, has been having second thoughts about the whole affair. His wife, apparently, was quite disturbed by the separation of children from their mothers. She's been making his life difficult. Helen always was a decent sort, Rebecca murmured. More than decent. She's been letting the girls visit Dr. Webb for health checkups rather frequently. During one such visit, she suggested that Emma was looking peaked and might benefit from country air. A temporary visit, she said, just to improve the child's constitution. Temporary, Margaret repeated, hope and fear clear in her voice. That's the official story. Unofficially, Helen told Dr. Webb that she's working on Thomas. She believes the girls belong with their mothers, and she's determined to make it happen. This is a test, of sorts. If it goes well, if there's no scandal or drama, she thinks she can convince Thomas to allow more visits. Maybe even... Doctor, Winters paused. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. My sisters? Emma piped up for the first time. Jane and Mary? Will they come too? Perhaps, sweetheart, Margaret said carefully. We must be patient. Jake watched the reunion with mixed emotions. Joy for Margaret, of course, and hope for Rebecca, but also worry the Hartley brothers hadn't struck him as the type to give up easily. This felt too simple, as if reading his thoughts. Doctor, Winters added quietly. Mr. Sterling suggests documenting everything. The child's health and happiness here, the stability of the home. If it does come to a legal battle, such evidence would be invaluable. The rest of the afternoon was bittersweet joy. Emma was full of stories about her sisters, chattering about Jane's latest adventures. She'd tried to ride the neighbor's dog like a horse, and Mary's songs. She'd learned to play simple tunes on the pianoforte. Rebecca drank in every word, tears streaming down her face. As the sun began to set, Dr. Winters prepared to leave. I'll return in a week to check on everyone. Remember, this is supposed to be for Emma's health, so some medical supervision is expected. After she left, they settled into a new routine with surprising ease. Emma was delighted with ranch life, following Margaret around like a shadow, helping with chores, marveling at the animals. She took to Jake immediately, perhaps starved for positive male attention after months with her cold uncles. That night, as Jake made his usual rounds before bed, he found Rebecca standing outside, looking up at the stars. Can't sleep, he asked. Too much hope, she said. It hurts, seeing Emma, hearing about Mary. I want my baby so much it's like a physical pain. Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth. We'll get her back. All of them. Helen Hartley sounds like an ally, and that's more than we had before. What if they change their minds? What if they take Emma back and we never see any of them again? Then we'll have had this time, Jake said, and we'll keep fighting. But Rebecca, I don't think that'll happen. Things are changing. The way Dr. Winters can practice medicine here, the way you and Margaret have been accepted by the community despite your circumstances. The old ways, the old laws, they're bending. You're an optimist. Jake Morrison. Never was before. He admitted. You and Margaret changed that, showed me life could be more than just surviving. They stood together under the vast canopy of stars, the night sounds of the prairie around them. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret singing softly to Emma, the same lullaby she'd probably sung years ago. The next days were some of the happiest the ranch had seen. Emma threw herself into farm life with enthusiasm, gathering eggs and squealing when the hens pecked, learning to milk the cow, getting more on herself than in the pail at first, and riding Jake's gentlest horse with whoops of joy. She also bridged something between the adults. With a child in the house, the last walls came down. Jake and Rebecca's growing love became more open, sealed with a kiss Emma witnessed and approved of with a giggling, "Finally!" Margaret, too, seemed to bloom with her daughter near. She stood taller, smiled more, and threw herself into her correspondence with the doctor. Winters about medical training with renewed vigor. I want to help other women, she said one evening. Women who've been through what we have. There's so much suffering that could be eased with proper care and understanding. A week later, as Dr. Winters had promised, she returned. But this time, her buggy carried 2 small passengers, Jane! Mary!" Emma shrieked, and then all three girls were running toward each other. Rebecca made a sound like a wounded animal and swayed on her feet. Jake caught her, holding her steady as her daughter, dark-haired and bright-eyed, so like her mother, approached shyly. "Mama?" Mary said uncertainly. "Aunt Helen said you weren't dead. She said you lived on a ranch with horses and chickens. Do you really?" "Yes, my darling," Rebecca managed through her tears. "Yes, I really do, and I've missed you every single day." The reunion was everything Jake had hoped for and more. Jane, 6 and fearless as Margaret had described, immediately wanted to see everything. Mary, more cautious, stayed close to Rebecca but hummed constantly, little songs about everything she saw. Doctor. Winters pulled Jake aside. "This is still unofficial. Helen is taking a great risk, but she's convinced Thomas that a month in the country would benefit all the girls, a month to prove that this is where they belong. And William is in San Francisco on business. What he doesn't know won't hurt him, at least for now." That month passed in a blur of activity and joy. The girls transformed the ranch from a place of quiet purpose to one of constant motion and laughter. They helped with chores, learned to ride, played in the creek, and filled the evening air with their voices. Jake taught them practical skills: how to mend a fence, tend animals, read the weather. Margaret continued their education with books and writing. Rebecca taught them to cook and garden and, most importantly, that they were loved beyond measure. The community embraced them immediately. At Sunday church services, the families welcomed the girls warmly. Mrs. Patterson, the former gossip, now clucked approvingly about those poor motherless lambs finally where they belong. Jim Bradley's wife invited them for picnics, and his children became fast friends with the girls, but it was the quiet moments Jake treasured most. Mary curled in Rebecca's lap, singing softly, Jane helping him with evening chores, chattering about her day, Emma reading to her sisters by lamplight, her voice clear and confident. These were the sounds of family, of home. As the month drew to a close, tension grew. Would Helen Hartley keep her word? Would the girls be taken away again? The answer came in the form of Thomas Hartley himself, riding up alone on a dusty afternoon. Everyone froze, but he dismounted slowly, removing his hat. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. They gathered in the main room, the girls clinging to their mothers. Thomas looked older than Jake remembered, worn down by something. "Helen was right," he said without preamble. "What we did was wrong, cruel. I've watched my own children this past month. Imagine them taken from Helen. And I couldn't bear it." He looked at Margaret and Rebecca. "I'm sorry. It's not enough, but I'm sorry." "What about William?" Margaret asked carefully. "William is my brother, but he's not my conscience. I've consulted lawyers of my own. The abandonment gives you grounds to challenge the original contracts. I won't fight it. Neither will Helen." "And the girls?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas smiled sadly. "Look at them. Look how they've thrived here in just a month. They belong with their mothers. Helen's already packing their things." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Mary began to sing, a simple, wordless tune of pure joy. Jane joined in with enthusiasm, if not melody, and Emma's clearer voice rose above them both. The music filled the room, filled their hearts, proclaimed what words couldn't express. Later, as Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "William won't give up easily, but Helen and I will stand with you. And I think, given time, even he'll see this is right." "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for giving us back our lives." That evening, as the extended family gathered for supper, Jake and Rebecca side by side, Margaret at the head of the table like a ship's captain, the three girls chattering and laughing. Jake marveled at the twists of fate that had brought them all together. He raised his cup of coffee in a toast. "To second chances, to family found and reunited," Margaret added. "To love in all its forms," Rebecca said, her eyes meeting Jake's. "To horses," Jane shouted, making everyone laugh. "To songs," Mary added, not to be outdone. To home. Emma concluded with 5-year-old wisdom. They drank, milk for the girls, coffee for the adults, and the sunset through the windows painted their faces gold. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and free, but inside, in the circle of lamplight and love, 7 people who had been broken in different ways discovered they'd been reformed into something beautiful and whole. The house that had stood empty of laughter for 7 long years now rang with it. The man who'd thought his heart buried with his first family had found room for a second. The women who'd been told they were worthless had proved their infinite worth. And the children who'd been stolen had been returned to where they belonged. As night fell over the Colorado Territory, the Morrison Ranch settled into peaceful rest. In the barn, horses dozed. In the coop, chickens roosted. And in the house, a family, unconventional but unbreakable, prepared for all the tomorrows to come. The frontier had always been a place for new beginnings. Tonight, it had proven that truth once again, under the vast western sky, where anything was possible if you had courage enough to reach for it. Love and justice had finally found their way home. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, resilience, and second chances in the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed following Jake, Margaret, Rebecca, and their daughters on their journey to becoming a family. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of the American frontier. And share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. Did it touch your heart? What was your favorite moment? Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset of hope.